Yeah, welcome to another episode of Simply Bitcoin IRL. Today we have a very, very special guest. We have Radley Rettler. He is the director of the Bitcoin Research. He's the director of the Bitcoin Research Institute and a philosophy professor at the University of Wyoming. Incredibly excited for this conversation, but before we jump into it, I do want to give a shout out to Simply Bitcoin's lead sponsor. Of course, I'm talking about Bitcoin Well. Bitcoin Well is the best place to build your automatic self-custody Bitcoin stack. What does that mean? That means every time you buy Bitcoin on Bitcoin Well, it goes straight to your self-custody Bitcoin wallet address. The platform doesn't even allow you to leave Bitcoin on the exchange, which perfectly aligns with the Simply Bitcoin ethos of the separation of money and state, because after all, the revolution is self-custody. Support self-custody by default Bitcoin on-ramps like bitcoinwell.com. Head over there today, and if you use promo code SimplyBTC, you get 3 tosses into the Bitcoin Wishing Well. The Bitcoin Wishing Well is a contest. It's like a coin flip, and every time you toss a coin into the Bitcoin Wishing Well, you have an opportunity to win up to 1 million Satoshis. You win every single time, by the way. So head over to bitcoinwell.com, use promo code SimplyBTC to get started. All right, everybody, I do want to bring a guest for today. Brad, how you doing? Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it, man. So, dude, I'm excited for this conversation. So much to get to. So hold on a second. So you are the director of the Bitcoin Research Institute. What is? I didn't even know that existed. What is that?
It has existed for less than a month. So you're forgiven for not knowing that. We announced it at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville. And it is, an academic unit within the University of Wyoming and the College of Arts and Sciences that exists to produce peer-reviewed academic research on Bitcoin.
And how's that doing? Because I feel like and please correct me if I'm wrong here, I feel like all the peer-reviewed people are like, Bitcoin's boiling the oceans.
Yeah, that's a problem. So in writing the book that Andrew Bailey and Craig Wormke and I wrote, we had to read a lot of the academic papers on Bitcoin, and some of them are very good, and some of them are very, very bad. And the ones that were the worst were the ones that made the most dire predictions about specifically things like Bitcoin's effect on climate change. And when you read them and dig into the details, you find faulty assumptions everywhere, misunderstandings, simple failures that should have been corrected. These weren't, areas where an argument went wrong or there was just a slight miss, but things like not knowing about difficulty adjustments, or not knowing about block sizes, or not knowing about layer 2s. And we just see these mistakes being made over and over again. Things where any Bitcoiner who didn't even have to go to college would read this paper and recognize, oh, they think this can happen, but Bitcoin's design guards against this ever happening. And so the more we encounter that, the more we're just thinking we need some sort of way to help these people write better papers. And so this is the idea that we came up with, and hopefully it can help correct some of this misinformation by, we think, actors who are trying to get it right, but just are making mistakes.
So, so I'm a little bit jaded when it comes to this stuff, because we have, of course we have our interview series, but we also have a daily show, and we cover the news a lot. And from my perspective, I believe a lot of the actors that are writing these papers are not acting in good faith, in my opinion, because here we are in the year 2024, right? This isn't, 2015, 2014. Bitcoin is tried and tested, and you still have these narratives like, Bitcoin is bad for the environment. Like, I mean, in Norway recently, they literally, which is nonsensical, they banned Bitcoin mining. The vast majority of Bitcoin mining is happening in the north of Norway, where, it's isolated energy pockets. You can't mine Bitcoin where, you can't just set up a Bitcoin mine in the middle of Manhattan, right? And one of the arguments that you always hear from politicians, which cite, these papers, is Bitcoin uses too much energy and it's actually making energy prices go up. That's nonsensical. Like, that is literally a stupid argument. And I remember some of the research that was coming out of the White House was citing a lot of these, papers. I'm sure you know exactly which papers they were citing. And it was, in my opinion, it was on purpose. Like, they were purposely citing papers that they know are incorrect. Like, the Coin Center and the Bitcoin Policy Institute have put in a tremendous amount of work to trying to educate, a lot of these politicians. I just don't believe they're sincere. And the reason that I believe they're not sincere is, depending on where you stand on this situation, but it's like they just want CBDCs. Like, they want to retain that privilege of being able to create money for free that everyone has to work for, that monopoly on money. So, I'm sure you've discovered a lot of skeletons in the closet, Brad. Am I wrong in assuming that?
So there's a lot going on there. First thing is, there is a pipeline from academic research to politicians, policymakers, bureaucrats, etc. And the pipeline often goes through journalism. So it might be that the reason that politicians are citing the academic papers that they're citing is because that's what journalists are relying on. So one of the goals of it, I think you've got the diagnosis exactly right. One of the goals of the Bitcoin Research Institute is to provide better academic research that can be relied on, both by people who are trying to combat the narratives of the current White House, and also by people who are trying to figure out the correct answer. So you might think that a lot of the politicians are coming up with what they believe and then looking to confirm what they believe by selectively citing research. Or you might think they're just looking at what gets cited. And it just so happens that a lot of the academic papers on Bitcoin are incorrect about some of these things. So that leads to the second problem, which is I think you're right that some of the academic research on Bitcoin is by motivated actors who are being disingenuous. I would specifically single out here Alex de Vries from the Dutch Central Bank. His research is often...
Wait. Are you saying that someone who's associated with the central bank would, misrepresent research? Are you claiming that?
Shocking, right? So he has... There are two persistent issues that come up in his reporting. One of them is just a lack of understanding of the physical characteristics of Bitcoin miners, assuming that they operate only for so long and then have to get thrown away. So he has a lot of papers on Bitcoin e-waste that turn out to be encoding false assumptions about how long miners can continue to remain profitable. And then the second problem, which is I think even more well known, is this statistic about how much energy per transaction Bitcoin uses. So he takes the amount of energy that miners use for a given block and then divides by the number of transactions in the block and then says, this is the per transaction cost. So every Bitcoin transaction costs as much as one household uses in a month or something. And he's been pressed on this point by a number of people and has admitted that this is a terrible way for two reasons. One, the block takes as much energy as it takes regardless of how many transactions are in the block. So transactions have no effect on miners' competition for block space and miner energy use. And the second thing is that Bitcoin doesn't have to use any energy at all beyond one laptop computer running mining software. Everything beyond that is used by choice because miners find it worth doing. And the reason is because it's economically incentivized. They get block rewards and people have decided that Bitcoin is worth a certain amount of purchasing power. So this per transaction metric is a ridiculous one. DeVries has admitted this, but continues to publish this. And since it's so short and sweet and surprising, it makes for a great soundbite. And it's one of those sort of like earworms that you hear it and you're like, oh yeah, this is something that I can remember. It's something I can cite. And if you don't like Bitcoin, it's something that you can continually bring up. It takes almost no effort to say, but it takes a whole lot of effort to debunk. And it's that classic internet rule that misinformation or bullshit takes a few seconds to create and much, much longer to correct. So
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
So yeah, and I agree with that 100%. But how much, like, again, it feels like he's colluding with certain politicians that, you know, it's like it's almost as if they're doing it on purpose. And at this point, like, I feel very confident that they're doing it on purpose. Like, I was the first one, me and Opti, we gave them the benefit of the doubt for over a year. And, you know, when so much information gets brought to light and you choose to ignore that information, like the hit piece from the New York Times comes to mind, right? Where, you know, the picture that they took that was essentially looking down on the mining operation, you know, that sky looked awfully dirty and dark. And it's like, wait a second, like Bitcoin miners don't emit, you know, CO2 and black smoke. Like what, like, that's what I'm trying to tell you. Like it almost feels like, you know, like it's like we could present them with the facts, but how interested are they in the facts? Or is it so important for us to, despite their non-interest in the truth, for us to continue in our research and to continue writing, you know, the pieces that you're writing, so that, you know, the people that are interested in seeking the truth at least have that content or that research available to them?
I think that the facts are on our side. And so continual presentation of the facts will sway people. Now, it's not going to sway everyone. And I'm not thinking that the Bitcoin Research Institute is going to solve the problem of politicians who are against Bitcoin citing fallacious Bitcoin research. What it might do is it might make for less fallacious Bitcoin research, because I think a lot of the academics really are trying to tell the truth. They come up with models, they run the models, they tweak assumptions. And if you give them a reason that the model that they're running with isn't right, then they fix it. That's one of the hallmarks of academic research, is this independence and willing to follow the evidence where it goes. And, you know, in writing Resistance Money, we ended up in our research saying some harsher things about Bitcoin privacy than we early on expected to say, because as we worked the details out, we realized that Bitcoin would benefit from being a lot more private than it in fact is. So just like we're following the evidence where it goes, we're hoping that researchers are wanting to do the same thing. We also think two things about politicians. One is they want to follow the evidence where it leads as well. They are incredibly busy, and they're not researching Bitcoin like we are. They have 1,000 things that they're supposed to be focused on, and they have staffs. Now, it could be that one staff member in one office is assigned to 10 topics, one of them being crypto, of which Bitcoin is a small part. So how much energy and effort can they actually dedicate to reading the Bitcoin research? Not too much, which is why Bitcoin Policy Institute exists, to translate the academic research to the politicians. Another thing that we think about politicians is that they are representing people who own Bitcoin. And some surprising facts are coming out about just how many Americans own Bitcoin and about the political makeup of those people. They are more liberal than conservative, and they are more young, and they are more by per capita people of color. And so it's becoming clear that the picture that's painted of Bitcoin to these people by people who hate Bitcoin is not an accurate picture. This idea of the tech bro or even the crypto VC is not the vast majority of people who use Bitcoin. It's a young, probably person living in a democratic area. And so I think what we're seeing is that politicians are looking for reasons to be in favor of Bitcoin because their constituents are in favor of Bitcoin. And there are good reasons, and those reasons need to come to the fore. So one of the things that I have been thinking in the last week or so, right? I attended the Crypto for Harris town hall, and I spoke with one of the organizers afterwards, and I was like, man, the only mention of Bitcoin on this call was Mark Cuban, who was, denigrating the Bitcoin maxis as elites, and then talking about him, one of the common people who need crypto. But the voters are people who own Bitcoin. They might say that they own crypto more broadly, but the vast majority of what they own is Bitcoin. And they don't care about the entrepreneurial climate for crypto companies or blockchain companies. What they care about is, am I going to be able to hold Bitcoin? And a lot of them care not just about, am I going to be able to buy Bitcoin ETFs, but can I self-custody my own Bitcoin? And so I'm hoping that we hear a lot more about self-custody in the upcoming discussions and a lot less about crypto venture capital and trying to make a space for digital assets and things like that. I think Bitcoin is resistance money. I think it's really important that resistance money exists. And so I'm interested in people understanding those aspects of Bitcoin.
100%. So let's pivot the conversation to the book, right? Which is Resistance Money, a philosophical case for Bitcoin. Could you just give like a quick lowdown? Like, first of all, what inspired you to write that book? What was the journey of writing that book? And what's the general emphasis? Like, what is the goal of Resistance Money?
The inspiration for writing the book was the desire to think more about Bitcoin and to do so in the way that we've been trained to think about things. So there's certainly economic approaches to Bitcoin, legal approaches. As trained philosophers, we're good at one thing, which is doing philosophy. So Andrew and Craig and I had been talking about Bitcoin for a while. We'd written some papers, and we thought it was worth trying to do something like this. We wanted it to be accessible to non-academics, people who have not been trained. And so I had in mind, my target audience was like my parents, who are in favor of me. They're willing to read a really long book, but they don't know anything about Bitcoin other than that it's like this computer money thing. So we try not to bring in too much ideological baggage, political, religious, even philosophical. We try to start from as common a ground as we can. And we acknowledge that we have biases, right? We've been using Bitcoin for a while. We also point out that people who are against Bitcoin also have biases, maybe reputational, maybe opportunity cost reasons. They heard about Bitcoin in 2011, they didn't get any, and now they just have to be right that Bitcoin is worthless. Otherwise, they'll have missed out on life-changing money. So we thought the best way of figuring out how to evaluate Bitcoin and get around these biases is to imagine that tomorrow you could wake up as anyone in the world. You know all the facts about all these 8 billion people. And you don't know which one of them you're going to be. Would you want to wake up in a Bitcoin world or a non-Bitcoin world? And then we go through some features of Bitcoin that bear on this decision, like Bitcoin's privacy, censorship resistance, inclusion, monetary policy, security, and things like that. And we think for the vast majority of people, they are better off in a Bitcoin world than a non-Bitcoin world. They can live a better life if they have access to Bitcoin. Some of those people need Bitcoin just to survive. They're being pursued by authoritarian governments, and it's hard to use cash. They're trying to leave the country that they were born in, and they know the cash is going to get confiscated at some point, but they can memorize a seed phrase and leave. Maybe they live in a country with extra high inflation, and if they don't have access to Bitcoin, they're not going to be able to afford to eat a month from now. So the people that do benefit from Bitcoin, a lot of them benefit a whole lot. And the people that are harmed by Bitcoin, by and large, aren't harmed that much. And they're harmed, we think, not by the existence of Bitcoin itself, but by some externalities about Bitcoin, specifically mining, that can be undone or fixed. They're not inherent to Bitcoin. They're just accidental facts about how Bitcoin works in the current system. So the book overall is an argument that Bitcoin is good for the world, and it's trying to help people get in this neutral, unbiased perspective in order to be able to see that.
Yeah, it's 100% true. I think if people knew the power of self-custody, the power of being able to write down or memorize, if you're in a pickle, to be quite frank, 12 words and then being able to bring all your wealth with you, it would fundamentally change the world. Now, you would think that, especially this is the trend that I'm starting to see in the United States, unfortunately, because I believe Bitcoin is for everyone, and I believe that it's a nonpartisan issue. But the trend that I'm seeing in the United States is you're seeing more of an it's not a monolith, to be specific, but you're seeing more of an acceptance coming from the political right, and then you're seeing like a pushback from the political left. And to me, it's a little bit confusing because Bitcoin is the most equitable, equal money the world has ever seen, and it helps the people that are most affected by the ravages of inflation, which are the lower and middle classes, the people that are saving and earning in fiat. Those are left-wing progressive causes, right? Helping the little guy, helping the guy who's disenfranchised, helping, the underprivileged people in society. I'm very surprised that you're seeing so much pushback from, the left in the United States. And now it's official, right? Before it was kind of in the dark a little bit, but you had the Republican Party release their policy, and they said that protect the right to self-custody, protect the right to mine. And then you see the Democratic Party release their policy. No mention of any of these things. Now, they've walked it back a little bit because it's an election year, but what I've been saying on Twitter for the last 3 weeks, when I see the whole crypto for Harris and all that stuff, it's like talk is cheap, actions are expensive, and we want actions now. And one of the things that happened recently too, which I found very interesting, was they held a town hall for the crypto for Harris the same day the Fed and the FDIC sued Customers Bank. Customers Bank is one of the last remaining Bitcoin / crypto friendly banks in the United States. So it's like slapping you in the back, right? And at the same time saying, you know what? Trust us, bro. We're going to change our policy from what has happened over the last, 3.5 years. You have Chuck Schumer coming out saying we're going to pass these bills and all these, all this good talk. But it's it comes to a point where Bitcoin is for the disenfranchised. Bitcoin is resistance money, to use your term. Bitcoin is for people that live in totalitarian regimes. It allows them to, for the first time in human history, own private property in a way without fear of confiscation. That to me is perplexing. I don't understand. And the rabbit hole I've come to recently is I don't believe they actually really meant those things. I can't come to a conclusion where it's we've shown them the facts. People like yourself have done incredible work trying to show this, and they're still hitting us with a metaphoric 2x4. And I've gone into, for example, a space held by the Krasenstein twins, Dennis Porter and and my friends over at the Progressive Case for Bitcoin, and they were making the case of let's support Kamala. And I go in there and I said, guys, like, I get it. You know, this is great. Bitcoin is bipartisan. But one guy is telling me I'm going to protect the right to self-custody. I'm going to free Ross. I'm going to protect the mining industry. And the other party is like not saying those things. At what point do we say, like, you know what? Like, I get it, but you got to show us something. Like, you're in the executive branch right now. You can free Ross if you want to, you know? So I don't know if that's something that you've come across in your circles.
Yeah, that would be a baller move, by the way, freeing Ross right now.
It would end the momentum. It would
Yeah.
It would literally take away the crypto Bitcoin momentum off from the Trump camp. And if Kamala just said, I'm going to protect whatever, then all of a sudden that voter, it's going to go half and half, right? Because now it's going to go down party lines. But now it's like, it's become partisan. And that's the last thing I want to happen in the United States, because it's like, now Republican candidate, okay, great for the industry. Democratic candidate, bad for the, like, it shouldn't be like that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So one of the interesting things is that Republicans are saying this and doing this when they don't have control of the executive branch. It will be interesting to see, if they were to win, whether they would follow through on protecting the right to self-custody Bitcoin, because in my opinion, and what we argue in the book, is that Bitcoin is anti-authoritarian money. It's money that makes it harder for authoritarians to enact their own agendas. And right now, Bitcoin is making it harder for the Biden administration to do the things that they want to do with money. And if there were a second Trump administration, it would make it harder for the Trump administration to do what they want to do with money. So it wouldn't surprise me to see Bitcoin support gather in whichever party is out of power at the moment. Ooh. And then the second they gain power, to go back on those promises.
Let's talk about that. I don't mean to interrupt you, because that goes right into the name of your book, which is resistance money, right? So why is that? Why is it that it's like Bitcoin is the money of enemies? Bitcoin is the money of the party or the power structure that isn't in power. Like, why is that the case?
It's because Bitcoin lacks three of the traditional roles that are done by public and private actors in the current monetary space. So a lot of people know Bitcoin supply cap 21 million. If you know one thing about Bitcoin and you're on Bitcoin Twitter, it's probably that. But the broader point is not that Bitcoin has a supply cap or that the supply cap is 21 million. The broader point is that Bitcoin doesn't have any rulers. There's no person or group of people that can change the monetary algorithm. There will be a block reward roughly every 10 minutes of 3.125 Bitcoin for the next 3 years and 10 months. And then it will be cut in half. The rules are well known and nobody can mess with them. This is in stark contrast to government-backed currencies that are run by individuals or boards or whatever. So Bitcoin resists monetary authorities at the creation stage. It also resists monetary authorities at the management stage, right? If you have dollars, you probably don't have physical cash under your mattress. You have it in a bank, and physical cash is printed by the feds. They have bank accounts with themselves. It's a whole messy picture. But Bitcoin, you can hold yourself. You don't have to rely on someone else managing it for you. You can also transact peer-to-peer with it. So it doesn't require mediators like Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, things like that. So at every point in the monetary flow, Bitcoin does away with the traditional authorities. And that's what makes it able to be resistance money, is that you're not relying on, indeed, you're disallowing mediators, managers, and makers of money. But then if you're someone who wants to use money making as a way of enacting an agenda, then Bitcoin makes it harder to do that, right? You obviously can't create Bitcoin, and the mere existence of Bitcoin makes the thing that you're creating more difficult to play around with, because you play around with it too much, people are going to go over to Bitcoin instead. So it disciplines central banks and it disciplines governments in a way that the people who are in power in those governments aren't going to like.
100%, 100%, and then that leads me to the next question, which I'm really interested about, which is kind of like the conversation from the sovereign individual, which is, and honestly, like if you spent enough time down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, you come to this inevitable conclusion, which is the very organization of society is going to radically change, because the balance of power from the state to the individual is going to move dramatically, especially if a portion of the population starts to take self-custody of Bitcoin. And I don't think that's compatible with the way that the current power structure is organized, where you have this giant nation state, this giant federal government that is essentially like spending money like a drunken sailor. They're talking stuff about like a 25%. What, like, that's insane, right? So it's like you tax income, you tax the income. With that income, you decide to invest in something. If you make a gain on that investment, they tax you again, and then they're also taxing you. You're also taxing your money via currency debasement. Right, that's a very kind of inefficient system, especially because of what we get in return. Like, what do we get in return for all these things? And now they're talking about instituting an unrealized gains tax, which is essentially a wealth tax. That's insane. I think Bitcoin is going to radically change that system, because in a way it defunds it a little bit. Like, the way that the reason that they're able to get away with a lot of this is, you know, they have essentially deputized the custodians of people's money, which are the banks, right? The custodians of if you own equities and stuff. It's like, not, you don't actually own the paper of the equity. You could, but that's not what most people do. They have it on their Robinhood account. So I think that they've planned the whole regulatory system around always having the assumption that there was going to be a handful of custodians that they can co-opt and deputize to act on the behalf of the government. Now that you have the individual has the capacity to store, like you said, vast sums of wealth in their mind if they're in a pickle. And you will memorize 12 words if you're in a pickle and your family depends on it. You will do that, right? Again, how is that enforceable? Like, how are you going to enforce the current system with something like Bitcoin? And I truly believe that's where a lot of the pushback comes from, is that perhaps some politicians see that, especially the central bankers, they see that and they're like, party's over. I kind of see like the more people find out about this, like, how are we going to explain that money needs to lose purchasing power in order to function? How do we explain that away? You know?
Yeah, I think that the existence of, so I differ with a lot of Bitcoiners on this, I think, or at least a lot of loud Bitcoiners who are vocal on Twitter, that I think governments are good. I think that they solve a lot of problems that are really difficult to solve without them. Certain kinds of collective action problems where it only makes sense to do something if a sufficiently large group of people do it. But there's penalties if you try and other people aren't doing it. And they also solve certain kinds of tragedies of the commons, right? So if you have like a big open field where anyone can graze, the best thing overall is for everyone to just graze their animals a little bit, let the vegetation come back. But the best thing for each individual is to like take it all. So when you come up against situations like this, ideally, in the best scenarios, governments are supposed to solve these problems. It's the reason why healthcare works better, I think, with governments than it does on GoFundMe's, where no individual is incentivized to pay for someone else's cancer treatments. And we might have to, but we want our own cancer treatments to be paid for if we end up getting cancer. So we buy into this system where eventually we'll get taken care of, but for now we take care of others. So all that to say, governments can do good things. Now, one of the problems with currency creation and distribution and stuff is that there's not really the kinds of checks and balances that you might want to make sure that the government is doing all and only good things. And so when you hear things about Bitcoin defunding wars, right, you can't just print as much money as you need and then go fight a war. Bitcoin will make it harder to fund wars. That seems pretty good to me. And I think that if you had these kinds of checks and balances, a lot of people would not vote for a lot of the international actions that their governments have taken in the last bunch of years. So in one sense, Bitcoin makes it harder to collect taxes to do that. It certainly makes it harder to print money and then do it if the money isn't worth as much because of the existence of Bitcoin. But does it make it harder to track people's wealth so that you can assess taxes for them? Yes and no. I guess a government that's determined enough, that has enough blockchain analytics going on, and a people that aren't sufficiently skilled at coin joining and using Lightning and things like that, it's not going to be that hard. And at sufficiently high amounts where the government is incentivized to do that, they're going to be able to do that, I think. This is one of the reasons for more privacy within Bitcoin. And you might think, well, we want the government to be able to do that. I mean, you might not think that, but people listening might think we want the government to be able to assess taxes because it's important. You might think that of your government, but it's not too hard to think of a government that could use that to harm people. And I guess the basic principle behind the book in Resistance Money is that even if you like the authorities in your monetary networks, even if you love the US central bank and you have a nice time with Visa and PayPal, it's not too hard to imagine how that might change with new political administration, new corporations in charge. And it's also not too hard to put yourself in the shoes of people who live in other countries. Do you think the same things of the Chinese government, the Russian government, the North Korean government, the British government, the Argentine? I mean, every government. It should be the case that people have access to something that their government can't take from them, because not all governments are perfect. In fact, no governments are perfect. Not all governments are even good.
Yeah, and just to be specific, right? Like, 'cause I don't want to come off as you thinking that I'm some type of anarchist or something. I think that society definitely needs the state. It definitely needs a government. But I think that the ability for them to just print money out of thin air has fundamentally corrupted the system. You mentioned checks and balances, and I agree with the other statements, by the way, where there are functions of government that are necessary. The healthcare thing is incredibly it's a tragic situation, because it's like you don't, especially when you get older or something. Like, I don't think it's acceptable for someone to die of a disease that is curable because they can't pay for it. That is, like that's something that is, and again, you could take that like libertarian stance is like, no, but that's where the humanity comes in, and it's like, no, that's a human being, right? So, and it's a very kind of difficult like conversation. But what I will say is, I think that the way that it's currently, the government is currently structured, where there's cities falling apart in the United States, not to mention the healthcare issue, and they've spent trillions of dollars funding foreign wars, like death, essentially. So it's like the priorities are all misaligned 1,000,000%. That money printer isn't being used to, save lives here in the United States or make cities better. it's almost like it's not almost like it's being used to line the pockets of politicians. Some of them have over $100 million net worth of a government salary. Like that doesn't happen naturally. So yeah, like I definitely see your point. I 100% agree. But at the same time, like you can't make a good argument that the government's unique ability to create money for free has corrupted the system to the core, and that the separation of money and state would be a good thing. And I don't know how you feel about El Salvador, but one of the things that I've noticed is I don't think it's a coincidence that the first country that made Bitcoin legal tender, all of a sudden that president is one of the most popular president in the Americas, and the crime rate has been significantly lowered. Like, I don't think that's a coincidence. So it's like, I think government is good, but I think that there needs to be a check on government. And I think that the spending that they're doing right now is completely being misallocated, and it's not helping the general populace. I think it's helping like an elite group of people while everyone else is getting poor. Would it be safe to say that?
It certainly seems to be the case. Wealth inequality is growing, and the national debt is climbing. The deficit is climbing. So I'm not. This is where an economist would be great to sort of give the potential causal link between these two things. But I mean, as a matter of fact, that seems to be what's happening. And so one of the things that might be possible is to discipline the spending by right now there's essentially no limit to what the government can pay for, because they can create the money to pay for it. And in some cases, this is a good thing, in my opinion. I was in favor of the stimulus checks during COVID. I had a lot of people here in town who couldn't pay rent and relied on that money to be able to pay their rent because they couldn't work as servers or bartenders or whatever. People weren't going out as much, etc. So that comes with a cost, and the cost is inflation. And sometimes it's good to pay that cost. A lot of times it's not good to pay that cost. And certainly it's been the case that not all of the national debt has been racked up in service of things that have been wise choices for adding to the money supply. And then it's, as I said, it always comes at the cost of inflation. Anytime there's more money and there's not a corresponding rise in the real economy and goods and services, then you get inflation. So it hasn't been tried for a while to discipline this kind of spending.
Can you though? Can you, like, is that possible, Brad? Because the way that I see it as a Bitcoiner is, absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you have the power of the money printer, I don't think as a Bitcoiner, I don't think anyone should have that godlike power, because it is essentially a godlike power. Like, essentially, the rest of us have to spend time and energy working for money, and then a bureaucratic elite in DC essentially can just create that money out of thin air. And that's in stark contrast to how Bitcoin works. Like if you want to make more Bitcoin, you got to buy it, earn it, or mine it. Like everyone else, it's a more equal system. So I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, you have to mine it. So there have to be miners going in order for more Bitcoin to exist. But they don't have to be working particularly hard. They do it in the current system because of how Bitcoin is valued and what the competition is. But as I pointed out in the problems with some of the academic research is they assume that mining has to grow at a certain rate, and they assume that a certain amount of energy has to be expended in order to mine Bitcoin. And really the number is almost zero that's required. So another interesting thing is, like, people who are the bureaucrats who are pushing the money printer aren't printing the money to their own accounts. They're printing the money to then pay for things which are ostensibly supposed to then create more goods and services in the real economy, which then offset the fact that there is more money going around. So in a perfect world, money is printed in a way that adds to the things in the world that are worth money at the same rate, and you don't get inflation. So when that doesn't happen, when you do get inflation, is when the new money has been misallocated. And this is a way of thinking about the success of the money printer is, has it led to inflation? If it has, then it's been misallocated. And given how inflation has happened, it seems pretty clear that it's been misallocated. So I don't know if any economists are listening to this and I have this totally wrong. I'm doing some epistemic trespassing here in areas that I'm not trained in. But it seems like, based on what I know of money creation and how inflation works, I think what I've said is right.
Yeah, I'm just going down the rabbit hole of my curiosity. I'm just enjoying this conversation because these are just really important topics and issues in regards to, what Bitcoin changes the game, to say the least. Anyways, I do want to pivot the conversation a little bit. So what's it like, being like a Bitcoin academic?
It's weird in academia. Especially
why is it weird?
Well, for a couple of reasons. One is you go to school in philosophy and then you go to grad school in philosophy, and there's this like agreed upon set of topics that you can work on depending on what area of philosophy you're interested in. My area was metaphysics. So you could think about space or time or material objects or properties or whatever. But you don't think really about Bitcoin, certainly. Even money. There's not too much going on in metaphysics of money. Now, that's been changing in the last maybe 5 years or so as people have been getting more interested in doing metaphysics about social reality, things that are human constructed and human dependent, race, gender, money, etc. But the other reason it's weird is that Bitcoin is something you can buy and sell and exchange for things. And so academics are perceived to be and demand that each other be sort of above those things. We don't get paid much money at all. We're supposed to have forsaken the life of making money in order to pursue the life of knowledge. And philosophers are, among the most caring about knowledge. So when you're doing philosophy about an asset, about something that is worth money, there's, I think, quite rightly and naturally, this question of conflict of interest or disclosure, or however you might want to put it. It's like, okay, you wrote this book on Bitcoin, but is that because you own Bitcoin? Is that because you're hoping this will make the price of Bitcoin go up and it'll make you wealthier? And so, we have to disclose, obviously, that we use Bitcoin, and we do disclose that. We've never been cagey about that. And we also, I think what a lot of people miss is that we could sell our Bitcoin if we were doing research and we thought this actually isn't good. The research that we're doing is leading us to believe that Bitcoin is bad for the world. Well, then we could stop using Bitcoin and we could get rid of the Bitcoin that we have and go do something else. So it's not the fact that we own Bitcoin that makes us do this research. It was doing the research that made us decide to use Bitcoin, that we thought Bitcoin was a good thing and that we could help the network by using it.
How has it changed you? How has Bitcoin changed you?
I think
it's a deep question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, some people tell these stories of like how Bitcoin came along with all these personal epiphanies and they started working out and they started like eating only meat or, all these other, I'm like, how did you get from one of those things to the other? I do think that Bitcoin has since working on Bitcoin, there are a few personal virtues that maybe have been strengthened in me. I think in areas I've been more patient. I've also, because the value of Bitcoin goes up and down. And once I started using Bitcoin, it was like, oh, how much I can pay for goes up and down. What I can have goes up and down. And so you just kind of get inoculated to that kind of thing and get a more wait and see attitude. But I think the biggest thing is, in writing the financial inclusion chapter and in including all the stories that we do of people who are using Bitcoin, I became a lot more aware of just how lucky I am to be born in a country that has one of the more responsible central banks and one of the more responsible governments in the world. And most people aren't as lucky as me. The vast majority of people have it much worse than me. And I think the people who are against Bitcoin aren't recognizing just how lucky they are to be in the situation that they're in. They don't need Bitcoin, and so they're against it. And they're not thinking about all these people. So I've just become a lot more aware of how the rest of the world is living. And that's developed more like compassion and empathy in me, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of other things. So I've given more charitably than I had in the past, both in raw numbers and also percentage wise, because I recognize that I didn't do anything to be able to be born into this relatively stable system. And now who knows how long it will be stable, but at least for my life so far, it's been relatively stable compared to all of the other ones.
Yeah, 100%. And as a first generation American, originally, my parents immigrated from Venezuela, right? One of the countries where you could make a very strong argument that, Bitcoin is literally, it's not an option or an investment. It is like it's a life raft, right? It's you don't buy Bitcoin out of just because you're interested in it as a speculative asset. You buy it out of necessity. And I completely agree with you. I think that the vast majority of the world doesn't have, I think Alex Gladstein coined the term financial privilege that we have here in the United States, where we have a relatively stable fiat currency that, isn't stealing enough for it to be dire. And most countries in the world don't have that special type of privilege. I mean, we've seen that all over Latin America. We've seen that in Africa a lot as well. And yeah, Bitcoin is definitely, it's like it comes in and kind of saves the day for a lot of those people. You did mention inclusivity, I think, earlier when you were talking about that. Could you tell some stories? Specifically, could you tell the one that has resonated with you the most?
Specifically on inclusivity?
Yes.
Or so the kind of light bulb moment for inclusivity, you have like a practical working out of inclusivity, where you just look at how many people use Bitcoin and how much of the Bitcoin is owned by people who own less than, let's say, 0.0001 Bitcoin. And it's a pretty high number. Like quite a lot of the Bitcoin is distributed amongst a lot of people. And so you see that also Bitcoin is trending towards more distribution. So every time that new all-time highs are reached, people who have a lot of Bitcoin sell a little bit of it, and people who've never bought Bitcoin before buy a little bit of it. And so Bitcoin is spreading itself out across the world in this way, which I think is a really cool thing. There's also this theoretical level of inclusivity, where if you want to participate in the current financial system, you have to somehow acquire dollars. And you can be given them by like a parent or a family member or someone under the table. But if you want to get paid, have a job, you have to go through quite an onerous process and get approval of others in order just to earn money. And if you want someone to manage that money, you have to go into a bank. So you got to be close enough to a bank to get there. You have to have a way to get there. Either live close enough to walk, or you have to have a car. And if you have a car, you have to have a driver's license, which is another thing that is granted to you by an institution. And so there's these roadblocks at every step of the way to trying to acquire money, which you need to live your life. If you want to get food, it's difficult to grow enough food for yourself in most places. You have to have a lot of land, and that costs money. There's no free land sitting around for people anymore. So at every point of trying to be involved in the current monetary system, there are roadblocks that are set up that some people don't meet. And for Bitcoin, there's one roadblock, and that roadblock is you got to have an internet connection somehow. There are people working on doing Bitcoin transactions over non-internet connected devices. They're still using phones and phone signals. You could do it over ham radio or something. But for the vast majority of people, you need probably a cell phone, probably that's connected to the internet. But the percentage of people in the world who have an internet connected cell phone is substantially higher than the percentage of people in the world that have a bank account. And so it's substantially easier for them to get Bitcoin than it is for them to interact with the banking system. So that's sort of that's not yet any individual stories of inclusion, but it does tell you something important structurally about Bitcoin, which is that it doesn't have these roadblocks that the current monetary system has, and that I'm happy making the moral claim that it's better to have a monetary system that has fewer roadblocks, that has fewer authorities that can determine whether or not you're allowed to participate. So yeah, then a lot of the stories that we tell are stories about the other important aspects of Bitcoin, people who are using it for the privacy or censorship resistant features or inflation. I don't remember, trying to remember from the financial inclusion chapter, whether that one does have stories. I'm not coming up with any off the top of my head, so I'm not sure.
I think you addressed it well, though, in my opinion. Now we are getting to the top of the hour, Brad, and I do want to give you an opportunity to leave a final message with our audience, specifically maybe something that was mind-blowing while you were doing all this research, while you were help writing this book, Resistance Money. So yeah, I'll give you the floor.
I think the message that's most important now to give is in light of these Bitcoin ETFs that have come out and just the changing in conversation around Bitcoin in the last even 4 or 5 months. Early on in my Bitcoin journey, the focus was on self-custody and on being outside of the government and things like that, a money that's not controlled by the state. And the conversation in the last months has shifted to politicians endorsing Bitcoin and politicians advocating for a strategic Bitcoin reserve, governments holding Bitcoin, people wanting an ETF so that they could have Bitcoin through IRAs and things like that. And so it seems to me like we're a far cry from where early Bitcoin conversations were, and for some of the reasons that Bitcoin was created. This is a cypherpunk movement that was searching for a digital cash that could be private and censorship resistant. And it seems like the conversation has shifted a lot, and people are wanting different things from Bitcoin than that. And one of the chapters in the book is just dedicated to considering and answering objections to Bitcoin. And I think one of the strongest objections to Bitcoin is this idea that it could potentially be like ideologically captured by the very things that it originally sought to undermine, which were governments and corporations. You have governments talking about owning up to 5% of the Bitcoin supply, and corporations who are now, I think BlackRock, I read yesterday, is the third biggest owner of Bitcoin after Satoshi and Binance. And that, for people who got into it for cypherpunk ethos, resistance money kinds of reasons, that should be a little bit scary, that so much of the Bitcoin supply is going to these entities that don't, I think, value the cypherpunk ethos. And so I guess if there's one thing that I would want to leave people with, it's that Bitcoin isn't an ETF. Bitcoin isn't a government treasury. Bitcoin is a resistance money. It's meant for people like us. But if we don't have control of our keys, if we're not transacting peer to peer, then a lot of the promise is gone, and a lot of what makes Bitcoin work as resistance money is gone.
Absolutely, man. Well, that was a very powerful conversation. I really enjoyed it quite a lot. And guys, go check out his book, Resistance Money, A Philosophical Case for Bitcoin. And Brad, I want to, again, thank you for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
I appreciate it. All right, guys. Well, we'll be back for the live show tomorrow at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, go check out Brad's book, Resistance Money, A Philosophical Case for Bitcoin. Peace out, everybody.
Episode was brought to you by BitcoinWell.com, on a mission to enable independence.